Okay, so I think we've got about 200 people here already, so we are going to make a start. So welcome and thanks very much for joining this AFN Network Plus webinar, where we're going to be talking to Chris Stark, one of the country's leading climate policy experts, and recently appointed by the new Labour government to head up the drive to clean energy. So I'm Jess Fredenberg, and I'm going to be your chair today. I'm based at the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia, where I'm the Knowledge Exchange Fellow for the AFN Network Plus. Also with me is Professor Neil Ward, who co-leads AFN and who is also based at UEA. So AFN is the UKRI-funded project focused on identifying research gaps that could help reduce emissions in the UK agri-food system. We currently have around 2,000 members across the UK, so please do join us if you'd like, if you haven't already, and I'll put the links in the chat shortly. So on to today's topic, we are very excited to have Chris with us today and thankful to him too for giving us the time, given the very big new role that he's just taken on in government and off a holiday that sounded like it wasn't a holiday as well. So thank you, Chris, for joining us. We're going to try a different format today. So rather than a presentation, Chris, Neil and I will be having a discussion for about 30 minutes where we'll be diving into Chris's insights, frustrations and kind of reflections on climate policy and particularly net zero and agri-food. Then we'll have about 30 minutes for audience questions afterwards. So we're going to sort of aim to try and cover roughly 5 sort of areas. So the first one will be sort of where we are now, a bit of a stock take, and how to drive change fast. Then we'll be looking at change in diets and whether it really could kind of save the day. Then we'll look at farming and land use and why change is so difficult. We'll also be asking Chris about political blockers and enablers and ideas for the new government. So Chris doesn't really need any introduction, but I'll give one anyway. He's one of the most well-known figures in climate policy and was, until April, Chief Executive of the UK's Climate Change Committee and then briefly CEO of the Carbon Trust before the new Energy Security and Net Zero Minister asked him to lead the UK's Mission Control Centre to accelerate the transition to green energy. So in his previous role at the Climate Change Committee, Chris led independent advice on the UK's net zero target, which was the world's first net zero target to be legislated, and directed development of pathways for the UK to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. And for the UK agri-food sector, that included a report, which I've got here. Probably many of you have read, Land Use Policies for a Net Zero UK. So if you've got any questions as we go along, please put them in the Q&A function and use the chat for other things. So Chris, if you've got your mic on, we will make a start. Thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to just start by asking, just very quickly, really, why has food and farming still not got a net zero plan?
Oh, it's a very good question, Jez, and I think it's something that I hope we'll address soon because that, to me, is the central issue. I mean, from the top, I'll just talk about this new job of mine, which is, as you have noticed, focused on energy. So I'm about to move to the UK government again in a very surprise move. I genuinely did not know I was going to do this job even just a few weeks ago. So when you and I were having a introductory chat about what we might cover today, I certainly didn't know anything about this. But it's interesting, isn't it, that the department that I'm going to is the one that already has the plans for net zero, and my job when I go there will be to try and turbo boost those plans even further and make the energy transition happen even more quickly in the UK. And I've got lots of ideas how to do that because we've done lots of thinking about it. And if you ask me, stepping back from the UK, if I look at the global transition that we need to go through to get somewhere close to the Paris temperature targets, I am very optimistic about our ability to make the energy transition happen. Whether it happens at the right pace is a separate issue, but I'm confident it can be done. The bit that's not happening is the change that we require in land use globally. And that is true at the global level, and it is also true at UK level. And we could debate why we don't have it, but I think the central issue is that there is a sort of collective failure to be as excited about the land use transition as there is, as you see in the energy transition. And there are lots of reasons for that. But whatever the reason, we're going to have to sort that out, because it is as important, and probably more so given the lack of progress so far, that we make the transition in land use globally and in the UK. And you need to do these things in parallel. So we will not meet net zero. Net zero is a very important goal globally because it's when we'll stop the warming of the planet. And if we don't have those changes in land use and changes in activity on land, and especially the question of what we do with agricultural land and what we do with forestry, we don't have those things sorted, we are not going to hit net zero, and we're going to find ourselves in an even worse position. So why don't we have it? Well, fundamentally at UK level, we don't have a land use framework, a land use change framework, which is something that in my old job, now I've got to talk about 2 jobs previous, we called for consistently. The need for some clarity about how we were going to handle land use change in the UK was something that the CCC continues to call for, and we didn't get it from the last government. So I very much am of the view that we will need to get it from the present government, and that is not something I'm familiar with, and I don't know the plans there yet, but that's something I'll certainly be pushing for internally. I actually think it can be quite motivating to do that too, because we haven't got that kind of clarity about what we're going to do with land across the UK. Most of the land that we have spare, if I can use that inverted commas, the land that we can play with and use and change, is agricultural land. So it is an agricultural question primarily, but what's beneath that, and what I think we'll talk about today, is, it's not as simple as sort of spelling out a change in land use. You've got to talk about the way in which we change practice and lifestyles on that land, and livelihoods for the people who own and work that land. So I can understand why it's politically difficult to do that, but it's important that we do.
Why, you sort of said there's a real kind of lack of excitement, I guess, around that change. Like, why is that? Is it that, like you say, it is politically complicated? There are also livelihoods involved. And is it something that can be made exciting, and with the different way of sort of framing it and picturing it?
I think it can. You probably would expect me to say that, but I do fundamentally believe that it can be made more exciting than it is. And I think the reason why we haven't made more progress is because we've had a fairly miserable discussion about these changes, actually. I mean, it's been framed primarily as a set of impositions on farmers. Let's just use that term if I can. And I don't think it's that surprising, therefore, that farmers have they haven't rejected anything. Actually, they haven't had any proposals put to them really that would allow them to respond positively or otherwise to those proposals. And the reason for that is that we haven't had that positive framing that we've had on the energy side. I think there is a slightly more fundamental thing running through this too, which applies to both the energy transition and the transition that we need to make in land and agriculture, which is that we've had for a while now, at least, a focus on net zero as being the reason to do this. And my feeling is that alone is not going to be a successful strategy for very much longer. In fact, it's probably not a very successful strategy already. It was a pretty remarkable period when we did the work in the CCC on net zero. Underpinning it was that document that you showed just earlier, Jess, the land use scenarios that we did prior to the work that we did on net zero, quite deliberately because we needed them. But that period of net zero itself, and net zero alone being the driving factor for doing all this stuff across the economy, is probably moving out of view now, and probably rightly so. I think we've got to get beneath that. So net zero is a condition. We absolutely should reach net zero at UK level, and at global level, it's essential that we reach net zero. We may even need to reach net negative in this country and other countries too. But that, as a driving factor, is running out of currency, I think. And the reason for that is that net zero has become a bit like a sort of containment vessel for a load of political concerns now that are not really about net zero at all, or the climate. You often have the word agenda now put next to net zero when you hear it talked about in certain quarters of the press, at least. And that, I think, is because it has been captured as a political slogan. It is no longer just a scientific goal. it's also a political slogan. And of course, that's not a motivating thing if you feel that you are being imposed upon and that your lifestyles are being forced to be changed. Now, I think it's perfectly possible to have a different discussion of what we need to do to get to net zero that is framed more positively without net zero alone being the only driver for that. And that is particularly true when it comes to land and ag. I think we are talking about, in the main, a change in the practice on land in this country that should continue to be lucrative for the people who are on it. And we need to frame that up in a different way. But we haven't been successful in that. And one of the ways in which we pitched this talk today is that one of my frustrations about that is that I think I have to accept that I'm part of part of the system that hasn't delivered that more positive framing. And I'm very keen that we change that, really. And I think that's going to be one of the big challenges that faces this government and the one after it and the one after it and the one after it and the one after it. So we need to start a better discussion on this.
Do you have a sense of what that framing could be?
Yeah, I have a few ways into it, but I'm also humble enough to say that I don't think I have all the answers here. And I think that, this will be a better discussion if I admit that from the off. We have talked about a set of changes that are partly about modern farming practice. And don't forget that most of the farming we have in this country is in some shape or form, shaped by policy or even driven by policy. So that is within our gift to change. We haven't really tried. So, this kind of the question of what incentives we give to those who work on the land, that's part of it. There is I think a more controversial, but nonetheless, we've got to open it up discussion about what incentives we give to those same farmers to sequester more carbon. And you could think of that as carbon as a crop. So there's a sort of, I don't expect any of this to happen without there being some flow of finance and some better financial incentives for farmers. So that idea of kind of carbon as a crop is definitely a part of this. And there is an even more controversial bit to this, which is that a small proportion of that farmland will be needed for things like energy crops. It's very small. There is an even more, and definitely relevant to my new job, discussion about whether some of that farmland might be used for energy production itself, and solar, most obviously. I don't find that quite so controversial because, I think that we're talking about a tiny fraction of farmland when we talk about that there. But the main controversy is definitely that the emissions that come from agriculture come mainly from livestock. And that is linked ultimately to another question about the nation's diet and what demand we have for the meat products that are produced on that land. And that has been enormously difficult to open up. And successive secretaries of state in DEFRA, I have to say, understandably, haven't wished to open it up at all. We had quite a difficult and extremely difficult period under the Conservative government where it was a complete emerita about some of those issues, which meant, of course, that we made no progress at all. This government will have to, I think, open up some of that a bit more, obviously. But again, if you frame this as a set of things that can't be done, it's not surprising that the people who are making their livelihood from the land at the moment aren't interested in having that discussion. So we're going to have to change it into a set of things that we would like to see done with the recompense that you'd expect for that at the end of it. Again, I think that's possible.
Well, you segued very nicely into our next topic, Chris, which is all around demand and will it save the day? So I guess a lot of models for kind of food system transformation, including the one I was referring to earlier, the Climate Change Committee's one, puts a kind of large emphasis on dietary change. Is this sensible and realistic? And if not, where does that kind of leave us, really?
So this is at the heart of the challenge that we've just talked about, I think. And it's maybe, since I have the platform to talk today, at least for a bit about why we care so much about that, about diet change, maybe it's worth explaining why we think that's so important. So in the CCC, we in the run up to doing the report on net zero, we're aware that we had a few gaps in our understanding. Well, some quite substantial gaps in our understanding. Some of those gaps were on the energy side. So we didn't have scenarios, for example, on the use of hydrogen in the future economy. We didn't have scenarios for how much carbon capture we needed to do, or indeed how many greenhouse gas removals we might require in the future. That sort of stuff we can model quite simply. So we had the kind of energy system modeling capability to do that, and we started to piece those things together. There were, however, other set of other gaps, like actually a bigger set of gaps that we didn't have answers to so easily because they're not about energy system modeling, and they were mainly around what we expected of nature and of agriculture and of land use change. And we did, in the run up to the net zero report, the report that you held up was our expression of fairly rudimentary but nonetheless important scenarios that we felt would be needed to underpin a more ambitious effort for the country to go beyond what was then an 80% reduction target by 2050. So we previously, when I started the job in the CCC, had a job to get to 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions between 1990 and 2050. We were aware that the Paris Agreement had been signed and that there was probably a need for us to go further. We didn't know it was going to be as far as net zero at that point when we did that report. But we didn't have the ability to look at what land we had in the UK and how it could be used differently. And fundamentally, what we were looking at was a set of scenarios for changing that in that report. And we freed up essentially some of the agricultural land that we had in the UK to do more, to do other things. That's basically the requirement was to cram more onto the land that we had within the UK. The UK is a very good place to look at that constraint question because we are, largely an island economy. Most of the land that we have in the UK is agricultural. The question, therefore, about what you could do in addition to what already happens on the land is a very constrained one. It's not like the US with prairie states where you can flip them to doing something else quite simply. So we looked at that question, and the most important challenge of all is that we needed to store more carbon in land through two main routes, essentially: peatland restoration, so storing it more in peatlands, which are increasingly drying out as the climate warms and as agriculture has dried out some of those peatlands. And then the other big and again controversial question is, where could we put more forestry, grow more and have more woodland creation? And that will not happen unless that happens on what is presently farmland. So the key constraint actually in that is that at the moment that land is mostly used for livestock rearing. Well, not mostly, but a lot of it is. We have emissions coming from sheep and cows, which are driving agricultural emissions to be higher than we would otherwise want them to be if we were cutting emissions across the whole economy. And some of that land we felt could be freed up to do especially woodland creation and forestry. And without reducing the livestock numbers, that would be very difficult. So we were looking at what were the conditions for that to happen. And of course, the key condition would be a change in demand for those products. Demand for lamb and beef. There are other things in play, of course, but those are the main driving factors. That in turn led to a question about what we could do with the nation's diet. So the link here is that it is a difficult link because we're not there is more going on than just the UK as a whole and its patterns of demand. But if in the CCC we felt if the nation's diet were to change away from meat, and especially red meat, towards a more vegetarian diet, and perhaps with more, let's call them exotic foodstuffs in there that are replacing those meat proteins with something that is produced in a different process, then that should allow us to free up some of that land to do more carbon sequestration. But that only happens with two conditions, really. One is that the incentives are there for the landowners and for the land managers for that to happen. And the second is that the change in the nation diet is not replaced with more imports. And the second of those is very problematic and difficult to model. And again, in the spirit of being as open as I can about it, I think we're still exploring how that interaction works. But however you look at it, there is a change in the nation's diet coming. It's already with us. And I suppose a big part of this is actually acknowledging that that's happening and saying to the farming community, wouldn't it be good if we got ahead of this and created new revenue streams for you while the nation's diet is happening, is changing? There is a kind of final point to the story on demand, which is we may need to go further than the change in the diet that is already underway in this country. I'm actually of the view that we probably don't need to go that much further than what's already coming down the pipe. And you can see that most obviously in the stats aren't as useful and data isn't as good as it could be, as I would like it to be on this, but you definitely see a change in diet just across the generations now very clearly in the data. Younger people are consuming less meat than older people, and what meat they consume is often processed meat. So there is there are conditions in place to achieve the sort of scenarios that we laid out in that land use report, but we don't see that happen without policy that supports the farming community to deliver it. And we don't see that, I suppose the final point I'll make on this, we don't see that happen unless there is some better communication of what I've tried to explain there to the public. And at the moment, it's framed as climate folks say you've got to stop eating meat so that farmers are put out of pocket. And that is not at all what we were envisaging when we did that work, but I'm afraid that's the prevailing narrative that's taken hold. So I'm very keen to try and shift that a bit.
Yeah, that's a sort of negative framing, isn't it, of going without on all levels, including for consumers. I'm going to hand over to Neil because I'm conscious of the time. So Neil, how's your Wi-Fi? All good. So the next topic is farming and land use. Why is change so difficult? So Neil, over to you.
Yes, hi Chris, and congratulations on the new role.
Thanks.
Picking up on the same topic, but if we just take it a bit further, perhaps. Do you have a sense of where this discussion about livestock and emissions is happening in a more comfortably framed way elsewhere in the world, or is there anything particularly and peculiarly British about how it's being talked about in the UK, and we could learn from other countries, or is this a sort of universal problem around the world, do you think?
No, I think it is a universal problem around the world, but I do think there are other parts of the world that are handling it differently. So the attack that is felt acutely by farmers is one that they are experiencing in other parts of the world too. You can look at French farmers, for example. There have been exactly the same issues there. There is a more positive framing that we tried to bring to it at the Climate Change Committee, which is about health. So we were looking at the kind of diet change that would be implied by some of the public health guidance, which was radically different to anything that the CCC was recommending, and much greater reductions in consumption of red meat, for example, were implied by Public Health England guidance, and there's similar guidance across the board. So this idea of sort of moving towards a healthier diet was definitely one way into it that we were exploring. And I think I'm right in saying that Public Health England guidance at one stage seemed to imply a reduction of about 80% in red meat consumption against some measure of the average consumption that we have at the moment. We were nowhere near that. We were looking at more like a reduction in a fifth over time. So that's kind of one aspect of it. My old chairman, Lord Deben, himself a farm owner and a strong advocate of British farming, he really liked the framing that we couldn't really ever model for him, which was that, eat a little less, but eat higher quality meat. And I very much, I think that is a good framing for it if we can pull it off. But he particularly, and we received a lot of criticism from some of the environmental community for that kind of framing, especially George Monbiot. I remember being very upset about some of that. So, it works to a degree when you frame it that way, but it doesn't really step away from the fact that practice itself is still tricky. And it definitely doesn't get away from the fact that we may well still import very cheap meat from other places and essentially export the problem somewhere else if we don't put some sort of control around that and create a level playing field for livestock production. So I'm not sure there's a great place to look for an example of this, but we are now seeing some moves on the continent, at least, to try and put some sort of, you might call, carbon tax on the production of that meat. That was not something we ever felt we wanted to touch in the UK advice, because we didn't think it was necessary to do it. But it's very interesting to see that is now happening in some parts of the continent. There's a more live discussion about that. Again, I think that points back to an overly negative framing of this. I'll end on maybe a more interesting development, which again comes from our friends in France, which I confess is not even an idea that we had in the CCC, but it's just so exciting to see it happen, which is under pressure from the French farmers, not on climate policies particularly actually, but Their worry is more the importation of cheap food products from other parts of the world, and especially meat. The French government are looking to the retailers of food to do more and to develop a sustainable supply chain for the products that they themselves sell, and also to do some better labeling of those products. And that sort of policy target of the food retailers, especially supermarkets, to themselves drive the process of developing better supply chains that are also more in line with the carbon targets, I think is an underused policy route. I think it's a really exciting way to look at it, because we know that the retailers have a huge amount of influence over what we eat. You can tell that because you can read published studies, and just the positioning of foodstuffs in a supermarket actually can lead to different patterns of consumption. So I think there's a kind of target there, to use a term that already sounds threatening, but it shouldn't. But that idea of going to the retailers themselves as being a better way through this is something that I wish I'd explored more actually at the CCC, and maybe a better route through this to deal with both the diet issues, which I think are important, but also the question of buying well and buying in a sustainable way from a domestic supply chain.
Reading that report that the CCC produced, it must be 4 or 5 years ago now. One is sort of struck by the importance of the livestock emissions in the kind of overall calculation of UK agri-food system emissions, but also the afforestation and tree planting and what's it called now, above ground sequestration, hedgerows and all that sort of thing, on the other side of the equation. And there's a kind of trade-off between those two. If we planted more trees, maybe could we get away with less diet change or a smaller reduction in livestock numbers, or they seem to be, there's a relationship between the two. I just wondered if you could say a bit about the thinking on that. That if net zero is a sort of non-negotiable, then there are different levers you could pull.
There's probably lots that exhibit it. I mean, I think that you're probably seeing in some of those scenarios a reflection of the fact that some of this is highly uncertain. So I'll go to an issue that hasn't come up yet, which is sort of soil carbon, which is something that those advocates for sort of grass-fed beef, for example, quite often talk about this idea that the land itself is enhanced by having the livestock on it, and it stores more carbon, and that we haven't paid enough attention to that. And there is some truth to that, that essentially, if you're rearing animals well, and if they're walking around that land, it can store more carbon in the soil. And there is definitely truth in that. You cannot escape from the fact, though, that patch of land that has the animals on it is a source of emissions because of the animals. And there is a marginal benefit to doing that type of farming and livestock rearing differently, in the fact that some of the soil can store more carbon. But the soil itself doesn't store the carbon for very long if the temperature changes that we're seeing in the planet continue to take hold. And I think the fundamental point is that if you were to put forestry on that patch of land, assuming it is, you could somehow switch that very easily to do so, it would store much more carbon. Much more carbon than the soil. So when we're modeling this stuff, we're up against that question of where is the, how do you model the amount of carbon that we need to sequester in the land, and where do you want to put it in that modeling? And trees are very useful when you could start with no tree and you grow a tree and you know how much carbon's in it. So that naturally, when you're doing a modeling exercise, you turn to the things that you know most about. And that idea of using forestry as something that is akin, I suppose, to a feature of the energy system is tempting. And I don't mind saying, I think that sometimes we've got that wrong. That you're looking to trees as almost a sort of technology, that you grow a thing under fairly certain circumstances, and then you know how much carbon is stored in it. In reality, it's much more messy than that. You're asking people who are earning a livelihood from that patch of land that I talked about to switch to a completely different skill. You're also potentially talking to a set of people whose lifestyle is connected fundamentally with the job that they do, and where even the terminology itself might shift across the country. So if you talk about tenant farmers in Wales, or if you talk about crofters in the north of Scotland, these are not the same conditions or lifestyles or employment prospects that we're talking about, and it's not possible to grow forestry in some of that land. So we were using fairly crude assessments, I don't mind admitting that, to try and look at freeing up roughly, let's say, a fifth of the land that we have in the UK presently for agriculture to do something else. And I'm not sure we always got that language right. And that definitely did not help. I mean, I sat in front of some very polite, but nonetheless upset and annoyed and Welsh farmers. I remember in one very memorable meeting I had in Wales. And it was very obvious to me in that meeting that we just didn't have the right language, actually, the right lexicon to have the discussion with them that I wanted to have. And that's also true of crofting in Scotland, where I'm from. And you can tell immediately that we're into fundamentally difficult topics that don't make it easy to have that discussion. But underneath it is this challenge that if we don't find a place to store that carbon in the natural world, then we're going to have to look to much more exotic forms of carbon sequestration, which are highly unproven, very, very expensive, and probably not that good actually for the environment in the same way as a more natural approach to this might be achieving lots of environmental aims, not just on the carbon front.
Neil, sorry, I think we need to move on to the next.
Yes, no, topic number 4. I was just going to the blockers and enablers of change. So you're very sort of creditably sort of self-critical when you look back at what the Climate Change Committee has been able to do, and sort of share some of the frustrations of how things could have been better. What would you do differently if you could do it again? Thinking about the last 5 years and the establishing of the net zero target, from the perspective of the agri-food system in the UK.
I think this is still the challenge. So I don't mind talking about what we do differently, because I think we're going to still have to do it differently. But I think we need to start from the position that the people who know most about the land are the people who work that land. And there will be, people who are very good at having this discussion, people who are very bad at having that discussion, but that's true in all areas of policy. So we've got to bring them in to have that discussion from the off. I feel that we were trying to provide something that was very top down to an audience that wasn't receptive to it or ready for it. And I feel often the best way to do this is to almost go the other way around, start build up from the bottom up to what can be done rather than what must be done. And my feeling is there's still lots of opportunity to make progress on this. That takes you into things like agroforestry, into more regenerative practices on land, which again were difficult to model. It's a messy business. And I stand by the scenarios that we built, because broadly we will need to store a certain amount of carbon in the land. And to do that, we're going to have to change the practice. So we're going to have to free up land, essentially. So if we don't start from the position that has to be done, then of course we won't make progress. But we don't need to have entirely rigid targets for that. And I think that was my other regret, I suppose, is that it sounded like we were having to make very rigid scenarios work, when in fact there's quite a lot of fluidity about these things. We don't know how much forestry we will actually need in the future. We don't know how many bioenergy crops we require in the future. And there is lots of room potentially to do some of these things in harmony with other things on that land. And I think getting into a more nuanced discussion about that was too tricky, actually, because we were moving at pace to try and build these scenarios, which are necessarily about large numbers, rudimentary numbers that kind of fit into a much bigger modeling exercise. But we've got the opportunity now to look again at some of that. So I think opening that up and working with the community, and I mean that in the broadest sense, of people who actually know about this stuff, would be the next stage of that. And that's, of course, what we didn't get from DEFRA under the last government. They were never that keen on having that discussion. But if you start from the position that something's got to change, and then invite people into the question of how they can shape that, I think that is generally a more positive discussion, and that's probably what we need to do now.
What would you say are the biggest, or have been the biggest blockers to, real progress on net zero in the agri-food system?
Well, the biggest blocker is the one I've talked about already, the political blocker to having any discussion, I think, about the change in demand that's required underneath these scenarios, and the need to give a different set of incentives to farmers. Now, we're in the middle of what, increasingly looks more and more like climate change is driving food insecurity. And every year we're seeing that food insecurity grow or change in some shape or form. So I think there is probably a more receptive audience to some of that. The challenge is, I'm afraid, that the farming community has a fairly fixed view, I think, about what support it needs, and is very good at making that argument to a department that is largely set up to deliver for those farmers, even if the relationship with the department has never been entirely cozy. Pushing into that relationship that is already quite tense, the idea that we've got to do a load of new stuff that on the face of it is about climate, is very challenging now. So I think we're probably going to have a different sort of discussion about a range of environmental services that we're looking the farmers themselves to deliver for, the greater good, amongst them climate services. And net zero, as I mentioned, is probably not the most motivating factor any longer for that discussion. So we've got to get into broader set of things, like, for example, things like flood protection and what we think we can expect from farmers by way of adaptation to some of these climate risks, as well as delivering greater food security, which is a message that they certainly are interested in having and discussing. So I think that's the biggest blocker, is the political framing of it generally. There is, I think, that's a set of lower level, nonetheless important blockers that it's very difficult to speak to the farming community in some parts of the country about any of these topics. So you've got I don't know what you call that, but there's a sort of narrative failure there, and an inability to sit and have a productive discussion about any of this in some parts. And I think for that we need the big farming representative, the NFU particularly, but it's not just the NFU, to come into the discussion more actively, as they once did. I think Minette Batters particularly was very good on this actually, but we then had essentially a crisis discussion that took over after the net zero framing had its day. So I think bringing NFU back to this is going to be very important, and NFU themselves they have a very good team on this stuff. So helping them to have more prominence in the policy debate.
Yeah, over to you, Jez. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. We're going to move over to questions from everybody, because we've got loads coming in. Just picking up on what you're just saying just now, Chris, about it being difficult sometimes to access or to talk to certain groups of farmers. There's a question from Joe Gosling from Innovate UK that says, is there scope to better celebrate and champion the farmers that are leading land use innovation to inspire others? And is there a place for this in climate change policy?
Yeah, because that's often the best way in, isn't it? You look to best practice and celebrate the fact that it's working. And again, although we tried a bit of that in the CCC, I think there's just so much more of that to come. I think my only concern with that is that often the sort of best practice, if I put it that way, or the good practice, isn't really at the sort of scale of change that we need. So we're seeing regenerative practices on farm, for example. Farming is a really lovely discussion, and I've visited farms and seen it, and you see it's really inspiring to see it. But it doesn't get to the core of those issues that I talked about earlier, that some of that land needs to be used in a different way fundamentally. So that's the bit where I've struggled, actually. That you can talk about, I'm going to use the word incremental, but I still think these are big shifts in farming practice. But there's quite a lot of that out there, actually, that you can look to. And these are really good stories of farmers continuing to earn a livelihood, really good employment prospects for people who work on that land, and different practices that are much more in line with a range of environmental concerns. That's lots of that, actually. But the challenge of changing practice, relearning some of the skills that we might need in the future farming community, low carbon farming itself. So to give you a stat, an insight into that, we did, aside from the land use change that we've talked about already, looking at the practice of farming itself, it's incredibly wasteful what we do with farming on the whole. There's some very good farming that happens in this country. There's also some very bad farming, to the extent that most of the measures that we were proposing for low carbon farming on the farm would be cost saving for farmers if they implemented them. And yet they don't. So we were, looking at this slightly odd practice, this slightly odd recommendation to DEFRA, that some of that might need to be regulated so that they save money. So it's a sort of, we're quite far off having that kind of positive set of examples that you asked me about, Jez, because we're not doing it. So, and my main worry actually is that the areas where we do see that tend to be more highly commercialized farming practices, which is not actually the sort of farming that often is the appealing thing that we're trying to push towards. It's sort of cramming a lot more onto that land, pretty intensive stuff happening there. And actually, we don't need to do all of that. So that to me isn't the kind of best practice that I'm talking about. So I'm not sure we have those stories actually out there. And I bet in this audience there's more knowledge of where we could do some of that. But yeah, that was very difficult for me. And as admittedly an urban dwelling analyst, we didn't have that kind of stuff at hand when we were recommending things at the CCC.
That's interesting. I wonder, I mean, do you think there's a role for government to take a more active role and sort of work with farmers to create these example kind of farms?
Yeah.
And I just want to tie that into a question from Georgie Barber, who's at the Food Farming and Countryside Commission and one of our champions, who said, what do you see as critical elements to an effective land use framework? And I'm sort of thinking, could you tie those things together?
Yeah, I mean, we've probably talked about some of the critical elements already. I mean, I think there is a lot of merit in having clarity about what the country as a whole is trying to do. And that's essentially what we were hoping to see from DEFRA in terms of a land use framework, because then you get into the question of how that's delivered. And that's what you see on the energy side. I think that's why the energy questions are easier in this country, is because we've got a lot more clarity about what the country's trying to do. I mean, I'm off to do a totally different job from the one I do at the moment, which is all about essentially shaping a goal for the imminent future and trying to make it happen much more quickly. That is possible because we've got some sense of what we need to do. We haven't got that in land use. So I think it's a bit of a mess at the moment. So essentially what I want from a land use framework is pretty simple, rudimentary stuff, actually. What are we trying to achieve? A sense of what the policy framework might be around that, and then an open engagement with the community, particularly the NFU and the farming community, about how we achieve that. And we haven't really got that at the moment. So we've got an impossible discussion, actually, where it is only the environmental community or the climate community that talks about the change in land use that's required. And therefore, it looks like an imposition from some eco-climate nuts. And of course, it shouldn't be like that. We should be talking about the way in which we continue to maintain livelihoods across the whole of the UK and all the different practices that happens across the UK. But we can't have that without that land use framework. So I don't have that high an ambition for that land use framework, except perhaps coming in with the government's own view of what those scenarios might need to look like in the future.
Okay. There's a question here from Viola, which I guess is almost about evidencing that as well, which is, what kind of what kind of evidence is most required by and what kind of evidence is most required and favoured by policymakers to make crucial decisions around land, for example, in the formulation of the land use framework?
So this is a great question, because there isn't well, when you join civil service and go to civil service finishing school, you're taught that the way policy happens is that you spot a problem, you analyze that problem, you put some options to a decision maker or a minister, and then the minister takes that decision and it gets fixed. And of course, it just absolutely does not happen that way. That is not the way that policy happens at all. Policy is a constantly fluid process. My experience is that ministers are often responding to a desire from the community people that they work closest with to change in some way. So who will the farming minister, I'm going to use that term, farming minister, who will the farming minister most be interested in? Will it be farmers themselves and the representatives of the farming community? So if you want to see some sort of change there, I think you've got to bring more than just analysis. And that's, again, the challenge when you're in the CCC, or even when you're in the net zero department in government. You're dealing with numbers and scenarios that are driven by a need to achieve a numerical target. And that's not going to be that compelling in DEFRA. I understand that entirely. So I'm going to jump to a totally different sector to give an example of where I think policy change has been much more effective. We saw with the transport sector, for years, decades, a resistance to look at decarbonising the vehicles on the roads that we have in the UK. And then recently, quite a rapid shift towards accepting and moving towards much more ambitious targets to reduce emissions, especially through the rollout of electric vehicles. That shift happened because the automotive sector itself got the right signals, and then eventually the automotive sector is the one who now do most of the running on the need for the support for electric vehicles. And I think that is a very good model potentially for the way in which we might think about farming into the future. For years, the automotive sector said we don't want to have any discussion at all about electric vehicles. And they're now in a position where they see a competitive threat from especially China and are actively engaging with government about the right conditions to support the sector to make the transition. And that is a kind of upstream discussion that is very similar, I think, to the farming discussion. And we're sort of in the early days of the same discussion it's still in its early days when it comes to farming. So can we get into a more productive discussion with the producers? Yes, I think we could. But that I think would be predicated on the idea that there will need to continue to be support for farming in different forms, but they need to be up for that. So that's a two-way discussion. And I don't know that you need to have numerical scenarios to make that happen. I think that almost comes next. Brian Eno is a music producer who also talks about climate change, and I also think it's quite interesting when you hear from people who are not in the same, they approach things a different way. I heard him talk last year about the role of the arts in the climate discussion, and he said something that really struck me. He was at Imperial College with a bunch of geeky modelers like me talking about climate change. He said to that room of people, "You are the problem." He said that you need to accept that those who are convinced by numbers are already convinced by that argument. But the people who are not convinced are the ones who are not going to be convinced by those same numbers. Then he said something much more interesting to me. He said the idea needs to come first. If you sell an idea to them, then they look for the evidence. And I think that's probably also true in this discussion, that we need a good idea about what a better future looks like, and then the numbers are there. So I'm very much to the view that the policy environment works in a much more organic way than perhaps you might think. It's not just about building a more and more compelling evidence base for the change. You need to feel motivated to make that change before you go to the evidence base.
All about storytelling.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, essentially. And I wonder what is the role for business and the private sector in that sort of storytelling and sort of drive to change?
Well, most of the change, I think, that we see in these policies for climate does come from the interaction between the private sector and government. So, there's a sort of, if I can draw a 2x2 classic strategy question, so 2x2 thing for you. If you can imagine, there's a sort of, at the bottom of my 2x2, you've got voters and you've got customers. And then at the top of my 2x2, you've got governments and business with its customers. What we think of as change is often thought between those two vertical links, that the customer demands something and a business supplies it, or the voter demands something and the government supplies it. I think actually the interesting stuff is the interaction at the top between government and companies and corporates. The reason I moved to the Carbon Trust is because I was very interested in that very thing. And most of the change happens in that discussion, I think. So if you get to a position where you have a government that indicates it wants to change, and you have a community, a business community that indicates that it's willing to have change, then you get into a really much more productive discussion about what can be done with policy. And at the bottom here, not to say this doesn't matter, but the evidence tells you, and we'll go back to my earlier talk about electric vehicles, very few people who actually drive cars were demanding an electric vehicle. They're very happy to drive that electric vehicle now that it's available and can be supplied and has all the benefits of driving it because it's very cheap to run. But that discussion didn't come from the customer base demanding an electric car. It came from a policy discussion that was above that. And I think that is the productive space actually that we can move into, but you need to, each party has to move a little. And I find, looking from the outside in, I should say, that is not happening at the moment. That we're in a very polarized discussion about targets that DEFRA as a department has to deliver, or the Scottish government or the Welsh government, whatever it is, and farming community or landowning community that doesn't want to change its position on these issues because they feel threatened. If we move slightly close to each other, that's where the good stuff happens, I find, generally. And that's true in all sectors. This is an odd sector in the sense that we haven't had it yet.
We are seeing retailers, aren't we, and other parts of the food sort of system saying that they want government to change things so that they can change. So it sort of moves on to a question from somebody called Nathan Nelson, who says there are 16 government departments making food policy in England, and he's put a link into on research.org. How would Chris coordinate across all of these departments to drive he did reduction in livestock farming that he's referring to? But I suppose we could expand that to just general net zero in agri-food transition.
So, as you would expect, given the role I'm moving to, I'm very keen on missions, but I'm not very keen on having 400 missions. So I think it's important that we do something. Just to talk about this new job of mine briefly again, I'm not going to this job because I'm desperately keen to decarbonize the power sector. It's not like I wake up every morning and think that's the one challenge. I'm doing it because I think it is it has the support of the Prime Minister. It is, of course, an important goal in and of itself to decarbonize the way we generate electricity, and to do so quickly is a really useful thing. But I'm also doing it because I think it is a useful mission into which you can build a much bigger system change. So if we are decarbonizing the power sector quickly, we need to think about the infrastructure we put across Britain. We need to think about the places in which we need to generate electricity in different ways. That's an infrastructure question, and it's an industry question as well. You got to think about jobs, and you got to think about the way in which we use that electricity, because the flexibility we need in the demand for electricity is actually part of the story overall of what we're doing to develop that power system. So it's a good mission because it's not solely about what it says on the tin. And I think those conditions apply here too when it comes to land use and agriculture and climate and the wider environmental services and the food system. But if we could define a better mission here, I would approach it in a very similar way to the way I intend to approach my next job. You can have that reach across government. And by the way, I'm certain that the questioner knows this. There's more than just those 16 departments making this food policy. You're right into what local authorities do, what's happening outside of the UK's borders, what people's perception of that is, what they do when they walk along a high street and shop for food. So, there's all sorts of things playing out there. And that idea of a mission around this is very appealing to me, actually, because I think I wouldn't define it through the climate lens. I would define it in a different way, with climate being one of the benefits that comes from tackling the mission well, to draw on the experience of the example I've just raised with the power sector. So I don't think we need to have too many more climate missions. I almost feel that the climate or the net zero outcome is just one of the happy benefits of tackling a broader mission here. And I think if we frame it in that way, that's probably the way into the more positive, productive discussion that I talked about.
I think that's really interesting. And I'm going to go on to a question from Professor Andy Jordan. So if you take what you've just said and sort of apply that to Andy's question, which is around the Climate Change Act being 20 years old in 2028. And he's sort of saying, other countries are starting to adopt national framework laws and sort of modelled on it. And how would you kind of give advice as to how something like that could be, what would be appropriate now, especially regarding things like the powers given to advisory bodies like the Climate Change Committee? So, like you said, how do you kind of take something and make it about climate but not climate, and how do you do that with sort of government bodies that are helping to sort of create evidence and lead sort of change on it?
Let's just talk about the Climate Change Act, because I still think it's a brilliant piece of legislation. I mean, I would say that, wouldn't I? Because I'm in some sense the product of it. But it is a very strong piece of legislation because it's so clear in what it's trying to do. So the sort of background to 2008 was when it passed into law. Prior to that, there had been some genuinely visionary work done on particularly the economics of climate change from the UK. So Professor Nick Stern, who's now at LSE, was then in the Treasury. I was in the Treasury at the time. I didn't work on climate policy, but it was a really big deal when he produced the Stern Review. And at that stage, the UK was absolutely at the forefront of the climate discussion globally. And at that point, the idea that you could have national legislation around it was actually quite a controversial talk. I mean, not many people felt you could actually. So that period of coming up with a piece of visionary legislation that set a template and a blueprint for how other countries could do it was absolutely the reason that the UK did it. The other condition that worked in 2008 was that the opposition fully supported it. So you had this Labour government, which would be out of power in a couple of years' time, but a David Cameron-led Conservative government that was looking for a way to demonstrate it was progressive. Really strong conditions to create this very strong framework for acting on climate change. But the other thing that worked with it, the way the Act works, is that it's a single target that you're aiming for. And that target is numerical. And it's about carbon or carbon equivalent. And it's such a good metric because it's in every corner of the economy. So you're looking at something that, driven by a single metric, can look at fundamental shifts in the whole system across the whole economy. That still works, I think. And the other thing that works is that the idea that governments themselves don't stick to those long-term goals unless there are conditions to make that continue to work. So the carbon budgets every 5 years are set as a carbon target that the government has to meet, and the Climate Change Committee oversees all of that. I think you could do similar things outside of climate, but my strong, and regularly when I was at CCC, people would come and ask me that question: what could we do on poverty? You know, that sort of child poverty is a really good example. Maybe you could put a metric around it, but the messier it gets, the harder it gets to make that work. In this question with the food system, I think you could select a range of metrics and put similar targets and ambitions around it, and then ask questions of how the system could be adapted to make that change happen more quickly and have some sort of independent oversight of it. I think that could be done, but it does rely on having the sufficient metrics and evidence around those metrics to make that thing work. And it is a messy old business, the food system. I mean, it's far, far more difficult to change the food system, I think, than it is to look and model the way in which we might reduce carbon in the energy system. So that it could be done, but I'm suggesting it might be more difficult than just putting a piece of legislation around it and creating an independent body to oversee it. I tend to think that we probably need something a bit more organic, to use that term.
Chris, thank you so much. It's now midday, so I think we're going to end it there. But huge food for thought. Really interesting to hear you talking a lot about, like you said, like a more organic kind of policy sort of framing and storytelling, and like you said, the importance of metrics and targets. But yeah, just really interesting. Thank you. Neil, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add at all, just at the end before we wrap up.
Just to add my thanks. It's been great having you talking to us, Chris, at this interesting pivotal moment in your career as you move on to your new role. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks for having me. It was great to talk.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And thank you everyone else also for coming and asking questions. Sorry we've not got through all of them. There were so many, but all really great. And someone's also asked if we can share the chat, because there's been loads of information sharing in there, so we'll do that. We'll be putting the video online in a few days as well, so if you want to check back and absorb things a bit more, do so then. I'll be emailing that around. We're going to have a break from webinars over August, so we'll restart in September. So Chris, thank you so much, and good luck with the new job. Looking forward to seeing.
Thanks. I better work out what it is, so I'm off to do that now.
Brilliant. Good luck. All right, thanks. Bye bye.